I'm indecisive as to how I'm supposed to talk about my favorite video game of all time, especially because many of the reasons why I love it are so intangible. The majority of my thoughts and feelings surrounding Super Smash Bros. Melee exist outside of the game itself, inseparable from who I was when I discovered it. The friends I made, the places it took me, Melee dragged me towards people from all walks of life who were as equally passionate and dedicated to the game as I was. It propelled us to scope garage sales for GameCubes together, to physically break our controllers beyond repair, to teeter under behemoth CRT televisions as we carried all of these items to meet in dingy scout halls en masse. Back in high school, I'd catch the train with friends to some guy's house who we'd never met before, don't tell my mum, just to play some stupid children's party game competitively. And obviously from the game developer's perspective, none of this was intentional. While other dev teams would kill for a following as rabid as this one, Nintendo actively frown upon this admittedly degenerate behavior, as Melee was never supposed to be anything more than a gift for little Xavier on Christmas morning. And yet over 2 decades later, the game's competitive scene is thriving as the metagame continues to evolve. The game's popularity recently saw a resurgence as Melee is now being played online, boasting rollback netcode and integrated matchmaking, resulting in a seismic shift in the community, as a new generation of top players are currently emerging. There just isn't another game this old that is consistently able to pack out a convention floor and have the event streamed to tens of thousands of live viewers. So, what is it about this game that causes a community to willingly put themselves through all of this? Especially when there's a newer, better looking, far more accessible Smash game right over here. And if you've ever asked that very question to someone who plays Melee competitively, I can imagine the frustration upon hearing the answer of, it's just not the same. So today, I'm going to try and decode what I think they mean by that, and why I think this is also just a damn fine casual single-player experience in its own right. And to do so, I think it's important we first go back to the game's release, and understand how the game's announcement bore this seemingly insurmountable weight of expectation, and how Nintendo, and more specifically HAL Laboratories, somehow exceeded all of them to create an experience adored by casual Nintendo fans and competitive players alike. In an age where every character reveal feels like this inescapable internet phenomenon, people tend to forget how massive a risk the original Super Smash Bros. Was. The game existed as this entirely new genre that blurred the lines between arcade brawlers and fighting games without really committing to either of them. And compounding on this unproven gameplay style were hesitant Nintendo executives who had lent their intellectual properties to the project with extreme caution. And fair enough, I can only imagine that the Pokemon president would have checked in on the game like, golly gosh, can't wait to see what Pikachu is up to. Ooh, he's holding a gun. And I think it was this same caution that was exercised by the Japanese audience upon the game's national release in January of '99. According to series creator Masahiro Sakurai, the commercial success of Smash 64 was a slow burn. Initially released exclusively to Japan, hesitant to release it to a wider market, it took until October of '99 to sell 1.1 million copies locally. In comparison, Resident Evil 3, released in September of '99, had already sold 1.2 million copies locally in its first month. I think a Japanese-specific audience were perhaps a little confused by the game's concept, and why it needed to exist, especially at a time where the arcade fighting game scene was thriving. Some floaty controls, graphics that were clearly a step behind the curve, and a lack of substantial single-player content meant the experience quickly lost its appeal once the after-school hangout had finished and all of your friends went home for dinner. So, despite being a massive commercial success once released in the West, I still think the gameplay just wasn't deep enough to establish a passionate following, when the home console audience that were interested in fighting games also had access to a PlayStation 1. So, beyond its admittedly stellar cast of recognizable characters, the core gameplay was left without any real identity. It was obvious HAL Laboratories had something unique here in bringing everyone's favorite Nintendo characters together, but the content was just unrefined. However, nothing was officially announced regarding a sequel that could potentially fix those oversights. That was until Japanese players who frequented the Super Smash Bros. Website around mid-99 began to notice polls asking for potential character ideas should there be a theoretical sequel. Users would hurriedly log in and submit the likes of Bowser, Peach, and Ganon, but Sakurai was adamant these polls were for nothing more than gauging interest. There was no tangible, credible announcement of development. There was no Super Smash Bros. 2. Or was there? May 2001 E3. Shigeru Miyamoto took the stage and directed the audience's attention to the big screen. Oh my god, those graphics. I still cannot believe how good Melee looks to this day. What you've mostly been witnessing so far is footage running at an upscaled fidelity on hardware it was never designed to run on, but even back in the day on a good old CRT, this game looked gorgeous. Like, do you remember what video games from 2001 looked like? They look like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, okay, like Conker's Bad Fur Day. Grand Theft Auto 3, have you played Devil May Cry lately? With the exception of Final Fantasy X on the superior PS2 hardware that received a budget of over $50 million when adjusted for inflation, Melee's graphics were a commendable second as these two titans towered above everything else at the time. But then came the release date. November 2001. A launch window title for the GameCube. How was the development staff possibly supposed to refine the game's edges with just 13 months of development time? It was a game that desperately needed attention in the details, yet it seemed as if the plan was to kick it out the door for a Christmas release. Internet users logged onto the video game forums in frenzy, speculating its level of polish. It was only 13 months for fans, but it might as well have been 13 years if you were caught up in all this speculation. And yet, soon enough, finally, after an agonizing wait, the day arrived. In November 2001, here was Super Smash Bros.
What's wrong with you, God?
Melee was this terrorizing mountain of content. The gameplay had been buffed to a mirror sheen. I'm talking buttery smooth 60 FPS combat, with new moves to master and items to play with. There were also the addition of game modes that were left out of the original, entirely new game modes, gimmick and party modes. On this channel we pay our respects to photo and camera modes. It just took everything that made the original a novelty and perfected it on just their second attempt. So as we begin to dissect how they did this, it's paramount I preface everything here with Melee's most important update of all. The fact that it finally established a core identity for this series, as it placed an emphasis on the celebration of Nintendo's history. It was immediately evident through the expanded character roster that boasted new iconic heroes, dastardly villains, and wildcard additions that no one expected. But those that didn't make the roster were still celebrated with the addition of trophies to be collected and admired within the game's menus, meaning Melee almost doubled as this archive of Nintendo's history, providing text, lore, and trivia into these obscure series, and I cannot overstate how important this flavor text was in developing a greater understanding for Nintendo as a child. At least here in Australia, where only around 30% of households had computers with internet access at the time, I bet a significant significant portion of players got the majority of their Nintendo knowledge from readings within Melee. It's something that Smash has only placed further emphasis on, as characters from the most obscure series continue to be dragged out from under Nintendo's bed and slapped onto the series' single-player game modes. You better believe I was one of 4 people who collectively pissed themselves upon seeing this little dude from the Culture Bit series in Ultimate, having put 76 hours into Nintendo Pocket Football Club for the 3DS. Don't ask me why. I mean, can you imagine the utter bewilderment from the guy playing Melee whose favorite game is Doshin the Giant? He would have thrown up right there on the carpet, like Doshin the Giant, everybody. Here he is. It felt like almost everyone was represented here, and those who were playable characters received the spotlight. A chance to display their personalities via moveset, animation, taunts, and essentially pitch to players that their respective series were worth looking into. The stages in which they fought on had also become much more dynamic, interactive, and lethal. Termina Great Bay, the GOAT stage Pokefloats, as well as the multiplayer debuts of Battlefield and Final Destination. Many of these were unlocked via the game's substantial single-player content, which had seen a much-needed facelift from Smash 64, as it finally provided engaging entertainment between the sleepovers with your pals. Home Run Contest has stolen hours of my life away from me, which is particularly heartbreaking considering it's 2022 and I still can't hit the fucking bat. And Break the Targets has even developed its own speedrunning scene. Most importantly though, the combat on these stages felt incredible. Gone was the floaty movement and prolonged hit stun from 64, and in its place, a variety of weighty characters that crashed back down to earth with blistering speed. With the exception of a few clone characters, selecting any one of them feels like you're playing an entirely new game. A character like Bowser is slow and sluggish, as if a triple gravity handicap has been applied, but the trade-off is that he hits like a train. So imagine the chess match that ensues when he faces a character like Jigglypuff, who thrives when airborne, as she dips in and out of range with the intention of chipping away at their opponent's percentage and patience before ending things with a devastating kill move. With the arrival of Melee, combat in Super Smash Bros. Finally became more complex, in that it embraced the dance that is utilizing the strengths of your character to position your opponent to expose the weaknesses of theirs. And unlike traditional 2D fighters that remain a tug-of-war to bully your opponent into the corner to overwhelm them, having cut off the majority of their offensive options, Melee's combat is unique in that victory is often determined by the player's creativity in utilizing the stage they're fighting on. Perhaps the most distinctive aspect of the Smash series, at least from a fighting game perspective, are the dimensions of the stages. The fact that you can fall off either side, and that it can often be scaled vertically, meant that battles are about controlling the space not just in front of you, but 360 degrees around your character. And it's this control that will ultimately determine the winner of every single match, as the player moving with the most fluidity determines the pace and momentum of the bout. If you're playing Marth, for example, you'd be wise to position yourself under a platform and fish for grabs to begin a sequence in which you attempt to keep your opponent airborne until you're satisfied with their percentage, in which you can finish them off with a kill move. Because while Marth has some handy, albeit predictable, grounded moves, they're nothing compared to the versatility of his moveset in the air. So, on a smaller stage, in combination with his long dash length, this strategy means Marth controls a suffocating amount of space. Even more so should you choose to utilize the technique/physics engine exploits, depending on how you look at it, of wave dashing and L cancelling. Now, I refuse to get into the virgin tech talk here of how they work, but I do think Melee has stuck around for as long as it has, partly because of these tournament legal exploits. See, when you start playing Melee, especially against other people who know what they're doing, you will be trash. But once you integrate these techniques into your playstyle, you can perform movements and soon combos that you simply could not upon picking up the controller for the first time. There's immense satisfaction and genuine pride in getting better at this game. So, while some casual players argue that inputting these commands should be considered cheating as they were never intended by the developer, I'd argue it actually strengthens Melee, turning it from a party game into a deeply personal experience. It's also important to know that performing these techniques actually have consequences if done incorrectly, as they leave you exposed to the opponent when you flub. So only the most skillful players who can repeatedly execute these moves without fault will be rewarded, meaning the more technically impressive player will win the overwhelming majority of the time. And if you dabble in competitive Melee, you might think that this is the reason why your more casual friends don't want to play with you anymore, and not because you're smelly. Time out here, actually, joking aside, people watching this who don't play Melee, for the record, we're mostly unscented. You're able to attend a tournament without a nose plug, as long as you just steer clear of the guy wearing the Bazinga t-shirt that's a couple sizes too small, and you're good, you know? Anyway, now because of this gameplay that rewards fluent tech skill, it's incredibly unlikely that an opponent will button mash their way to victory, as being unable to perform these moves puts you at an immediate disadvantage. You move slower, you can't cover as much ground, you get stuck in recovery animations. So you'll hardly ever see underdog victories in competitive Melee because you have to take 4 of your opponent's stocks or lives to win a match, and win a best of 3 or sometimes 5 matches to advance in a tournament bracket. Keep in mind, Melee is also one of the only fighting games where you can take your own stock. Nothing is catching you if you accidentally fall off the stage. So, with all of this in mind, if we're using a regular tournament rule set, you essentially have to defeat your opponent a minimum of 8 times. Fluke victories simply do not happen. Melee always rewards the player who works harder. I'd now like to transition this video into finally talking about this game's competitive scene, as watching professional Melee is some of the most fun I've ever had tuning into a live stream. It's something that I could make an entirely separate video on, as there's just too much to cover here. Needless to say, if you are at all interested in the chess match and metagame of Melee that I've highlighted thus far, and you somehow haven't heard of the Super Smash Bros. Documentaries by East Point Pictures, please do yourself a favor and seek them out, as they explore both the history and growth of the game from its grassroots origins to EVO mainstage, underscoring the players that defined those eras. What I took away from those documentaries, and what I subsequently learnt as I began to follow the pro scene as a result, is that through their playstyles alone, these pro players come across as larger than life. As silly as it sounds, Melee often drives its players to embody the characters they play as, or maybe it holds up a mirror to your personality as it's displayed through your character's actions on the screen. I honestly think it works both ways, but regardless, it makes for some absolutely fascinating clashes of ideologies, often on the biggest stages the scene has to offer. So let's say we talk about one of my favorite sets of all time, Mewtwo King vs. AMSA, from the 2014 tournament, Kings of Cali 4. To set the scene, by this point in time, pro Melee player Mewtwo King was considered the old god, the most dominant player of his era. Back in the late 2000s, this guy was untouchable. His understanding of the game at a technical level, worshipping the game's frame data to consistently perform the most logical, optimal moves and punishes every single time, meant that he simply did not lose. For a while, he was considered the best in the world at both Super Smash Bros. Melee and its sequel, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Other than a handful of tippy-top guys, playing against M2K around this time, especially his Marth or Sheik on Final Destination, was a death sentence for your average tournament goer's aspirations. So just imagine the pressure that his opponent was feeling as he sat down to compete against one of the greatest of all time. Hoping to do his best was none other than rising star in the scene, AMSA. AMSA is this Japanese guy who's just happy to be here, but here's the thing about AMSA. AMSA plays Yoshi. Nobody plays Yoshi. His inability to jump out of shield, slow rolling animation, and lack of true recovery, just to name a few flaws, means he's often reduced to a punching bag for faster characters. Even to this day, AMSA flies the flag by himself as the sole consistently placing Yoshi player. His sheer commitment to this stupid lizard means he has single-handedly dragged the character up the tier list on his back. However, For as crafty as he is with a character that most tournament goers wouldn't know how to match up against one of the greatest of all time, this set was bound to be a massacre. The best of 5 set begins with M2K establishing a commanding lead early, containing AMSA from creating any kind of rhythm or momentum. While the Yoshi hangs around as a respectable adversary, it never looks close. Game 1 ends exactly as predicted.
Like I said, I'm not trying to hate, but I can't see AMSA taking a game.
It's going to be very, very difficult.
As Game 2 begins in an even arm wrestle, AMSA's plan suddenly kicks into gear. Having counterpicked a stage with much tighter platforms, his movement becomes blisteringly fast. AMSA pulling off improvised combos that few watching had ever seen before as the energy in the room begins to change.
Ooh, he went for upward angle for. Oh!
That might be a kill. Oh, okay.
Just barely misses. That might be it.
Oh my god.
It did work, but he didn't go anywhere.
Clap.
So the first hit doesn't do any knockback, right? But the second one does hella.
However, almost in response to the erupting AMSA chants in the building, Mewtwo King immediately takes Game 3 to Final Destination.
No!
FD?
Mewtwo King's best stage. This might be a massacre.
As the platforms AMSA relied on for his match-winning movement in Game 2, now eliminated from the equation. Having come all this way, not just in the tournament currently in quarterfinals, but physically, being over 5,000 miles from home, what was AMSA going to find within himself to finally take the lead? Against all expectation, AMSA is somehow able to hold his own in the neutral game, and something happens within Mewtwo King as he begins to react to a very specific combination of variables that historically was his kryptonite. Playing an opponent whose actions he couldn't predict, and the pressure of an increasingly hostile crowd was the recipe that caused Mewtwo King to crumble.
Oh! These eggs don't make sense! That's it.
Oh my god!
In the last act of desperation, Mewtwo King switches characters, but it was too little, too late as the crowd feasts upon his uncertainty.
Are we gonna witness AMSA taking a set off of
one of the gods
of the game? Don't get too impatient, AMSA. Jabs?
The egg.
Oh, that's it!
That's
it! AMSA takes it! He does a Shoryuken in celebration! Mewtwo ejecting unplugging his controller.
An unassuming Japanese Yoshi player finding it within himself to sneak a win against one of the best of all time. Here were two men pushing themselves to their mental limits. I once heard someone say that when you physically fight someone, for those brief moments, you learn more about their character than even their loved ones know. And while I concede that's mostly shonen anime bullshit, I do think it's actually applicable to fighting games too. While admittedly melodramatic, it's these declarations through the characters and play styles that are what make Melee endlessly fascinating to play, watch, and talk about. You know, it was only in the making of this video did I finally realize what it is about Melee that makes it my favorite game of all time. I'm able to actually point to the thing in the game that I love about it now. That being the platform that it gives me to express myself, and the ability to share that with others, especially at a critical time in my life when I couldn't find the words to do so. I'm unable to ever repay what this game did for me. However, I understand my experience did come at a hefty cost. Sakurai described the development of Super Smash Bros. Melee as a destructive period in his life, and of course it was. He somehow churned out within just 13 months one of the most polished, content-rich video games I have ever played. And that deeply upsets me. I don't condone what he did. I refuse to glorify the crunch he and his team were put through, even if it was to make my favorite video game. I just wish there was some way of letting him know that those efforts legitimately changed the course of thousands of people's lives for the better. It's why the game refuses to die. It's why people turn their backs on the new iterations in this series. It isn't a matter of defiant stubbornness, it's to maintain the strength of their communities. So, if I've piqued your interest in potentially giving this game a try, let me assure you that the best time to get into Melee is right now. These days, All that's required is some nifty Googling to get Slippi up and running on your PC in a matter of minutes. However, I urge you to please still make the effort to seek out your local community because I promise you, they would love to have you. Even if this isn't for you though, hopefully you now understand a little bit more about this silly old children's party game from 2001 and why people like myself continue to play it. Thanks for watching.